So the other day I was chatting to a few young adults in and around the parish here at St Declan's, and we were talking about where we sort of fit in our family, who is the oldest, who is the middle child, who is the youngest, and whether or not we sort of fit into those stereotypes that people in those families, in those positions in the family tend to have. You know, the oldest child tends to be the responsible one, always making sure everyone's being well behaved and holding things together. The middle child often feels pretty squeezed in the middle from one way and the other. And the youngest children, I'm the youngest child in my family, which probably makes a whole lot of sense. The youngest child tends to be really annoying, really mischievous, and a little bit spoiled. But there is one thing, being the youngest is pretty good, but there is one thing particularly that's a bit of the burden of being the youngest is often it's very hard to have your voice to be heard or to be taken seriously. That was definitely true for me in my childhood. I'm the youngest of four, and together with my parents, we're very sick, stubborn and pig-headed people who always think that we're right. And so being the youngest, I often found it very, very hard to have my voice heard and my voice taken seriously. And I'm sure whether you're the youngest child or you're somewhere else in your family, whatever the reason it might be, that we've all had some experience in our life of sort of being a bit voiceless, of having a voice or having something to say and that not being heard or valued or appreciated. And when that isn't taken on, we aren't given the space to be able to have the voice that we want to have, we can find ourselves feeling quite rejected and diminished within ourselves. Now, on this Safeguarding Sunday, I don't want to draw the analogy too closely, but what I do want to suggest, and particularly our theme today, and this the last week we've had of Child Protection Week, has been that every conversation matters. So I think it's really important for us to recognise that even if we have had that experience of having an opinion that hasn't been heard, having that experience of feeling a little bit voiceless in the midst of a setting or a context that we can find ourselves in, that our experience of this pales in comparison to the horrors faced by those victims and survivors of abuse, those who became the voiceless in our midst. And I do want to take a moment just at the very beginning of the homily this morning, a moment to recognise and once again apologise for the great harm done by priests, religious and lay people in church settings, to apologise and recognise the many times, ways and places where the voice of the voiceless was not listened to, where it was rejected, squashed or dismissed. To recognise that rebuilding trust and confidence in the church requires constant work and vigilance, and that we recommit as a parish and as the joint twin parishes of St Declan's and St Joseph's to cultural change that will help to make our community a place that respects the dignity of all children and adults at risk and empowers and listens to all people, especially those who are most vulnerable in our midst. And that it's important that we all continue to pray for, to listen to, support and to care for those who have been abused and their families and their supporters. That it's important that we do heed the language of the first reading, that Isaiah is prophesying to the people who have been driven out of their promised land, who in exile find themselves voiceless, deaf and unable to hear and to remember the voice of God in their lives, unable to see God in their lives, unable to walk fully in the truth of God's love for them. That just as Isaiah is prophesying to a people rendered voiceless and driven out of their promised land, so too we again need to recognise those who, through the action and inaction of others, were driven from the place that should have been their own inheritance and promised land, which is the church. And so in light of this being Safeguarding Sunday and the ongoing challenge before us here at St Declan's and at St Joseph's to make our parish and parishes a place that's safe for all, a place where God's love can be brought to life in people, how might the gospel today give us some pointers of how we might live that out? And there's three things that I want to draw our attention to this morning. The first is the fact that this man who is healed, this man who is deaf and mute, he doesn't come alone, but he's brought by others. That we hear they brought him. What a beautiful, beautiful image that these people who knew this man, they took him by the hand and they brought him. And what this tells us is that we all share in this responsibility. We all have a role to play to make sure our parishes are the safest place that they can be. That the job of creating an environment and a culture isn't just a task for Father Chris to do and then we can all kind of watch and wish him the best as he goes on his merry way, but it's a task for all of us. Not simply to rest simply at the point of compliance and making sure we tick all the right boxes so we can deal with that and go on our merry way, but to ask ourselves, how do we make this a place which loves all people like Jesus has loved us? That's the best practice we want to go for, not just compliance, but to create a parish community which is about living out the gospel of love to everyone, including the most vulnerable. The second thing I want to draw our attention to is the very last line where they say, he has done all things well, speaking of Jesus, and they say, he makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Another translation says that he makes the deaf hear and he gives voice to the voiceless. What I want to ask and allow ourselves to wonder about is whether this order is actually important. And I think it is, because for the voiceless to have a voice, it requires people to listen to them. For the voiceless to have a voice, we can't be deaf to their cries. We have to ask God for the grace to restore our own ears, to restore our own gift of hearing, to wake us up to the ways that we've not listened with ears of love and faith, to allow us the grace to hear and to listen to and to love the voiceless. The third thing I want to mention is going back to our first one, that it says they brought him, but they brought him to Jesus. That the central part of this entire story is this encounter with Jesus that the deaf and mute man has. That the center of the story today and the center of our lives is that moment of encounter with Jesus. There's two ways we can talk about this. The first, of course, is our own need for this. That each and every one of us needs to encounter Jesus in our own way. To encounter the God who's loved us so completely that he's left heaven, he's crossed the horizon of human history and laid down his life for us. That we wouldn't be left in our sin and our brokenness, but we would be restored by his death and resurrection and be brought to the fullness of life, and that his love would be brought to the full in our lives. That we need this love. We need the love of Jesus. We need the healing of Jesus. We need the forgiveness of Jesus. We need the transformation of Jesus. And that by hearing him and speaking and living out the gospel, and by allowing his love to be brought to life in us, we're more free to listen to and give voice to the voiceless. And the second aspect of this is that when we allow God to heal our own deafness, we see that the voice of the most marginalized is restored. That this encounter with Jesus enables us to prioritize and make our parishes a safe community where we can hear, listen to, care for, and love the voiceless and most marginalized and vulnerable in our midst. So all of this is made possible simply through the great gift of the encounter with Jesus. So as we come to the Eucharist this morning, let's be open to this encounter with Jesus that makes everything else possible. Let's be open that he would open our ears to hear, our tongues to speak in such a way that makes this place a place where the voiceless truly do have a voice, where every conversation truly does matter, and where all people, especially the vulnerable, can be heard and in turn can heal and experience God's love for them, and his love can be brought to full in their life each and every day. Amen.